In what follows, I will first briefly repeat the conceptual framework of my project. Then I will exemplify this referring to a very significant historical episode, which as far as I remember, I did not mention in this circle until now. Just a few months ago, in April 2021, Pierre Prétout, professor of maritime history at the University of La Rochelle, published a book called L'invasion de la piraterie en France au Moyen Âge, within a series entitled Le Nœud Gordien, the Gordian Knot. The historian, as a sort of reborn Alexander, who uses his findings as a sword in order to conquer new lands in research. It is presumably due to this remarkable pretension brought up by the editors, I guess, that the author tried to sharpen his own position by downplaying a number of recent respective publications by other scholars. But well, that would be okay if Prétout at least had not ignored eminent aspects of his own context. He writes of the French Atlantic coast as compared to the Mediterranean, but Northern Europe, the entire region east of the English Channel, does hardly appear in his description. For the Hanse and the Holy Roman Empire, as far as he mentions them at all, he relies on peripheral, outdated and unscholarly literature, although there is plenty of very recent publications in different languages. Well, having said that, one has to say that this is, although a great book. As Prétout shows, until the late 15th century, the population of the coastal areas of France did not know anything about pirates at all. The entire idea that at sea there were bunches of devilish malefactors always striving for, well, unchecked violence and booty derives from classical literature, which courtiers used to read from the 12th century onwards. Pirata is a Latin term which remained constricted to savant tongue until the 15th century. Even the French equivalents, larron de mer and écumeur, only slowly seep into vernacular parlance. Apparently, apart from literary narratives, for a long time, there was simply no need for a respective term. But after the French crown had managed to bring considerable parts of the coastal areas of the realm under its control, it started to intensify its dominion within these and to discipline the gens de mer, the population of the maritime sphere. The endemic violence of the people going to sea came to be restricted by labeling it an offense against the king's majesty, high treason. The pirate, now in French, pirate, became the ideal antagonist of the king, whose most prominent issue now became to guarantee peace and common well-being. For example, when the crown required the construction of coastal watchtowers as a defense against piracy, some local communities claimed that they had never experienced such a threat and that they refused to pay for such useless measurements. That is not to say that the gens de mer had never experienced violence. Predation, arrest, and reprisals were well known in maritime life, but they were part of mercantile conflict management, not a menace to the common good. By making the fight against piracy the focal point of royal dominion over the seas, the kingdom installed a new regime within the maritime sphere. The more the king was modeled following the patterns of heroic romance, the more the pirate became his ideal enemy. To fight pirates meant to fulfill the most noble task of the king as a guardian of public order. Only from the 16th century onwards, this narrative became a legal concept, which then started to shape historical reality. Because, interestingly enough, until the 16th century, the kings never installed a law or any other form of legal ordering against piracy. There were no respective ordinances. The law books did not contain any decision concerning piracy until 1520. The Parlement did not treat cases of violence at sea, or very seldom. But in truces and peace treaties with the neighboring kingdoms of Castile, England, and Portugal, there were clauses on how to punish seamen disturbing the peace agreed upon. In practice, piracy was a new framing for how to treat the violence latent within life at sea, because the right to use force autonomously claimed for traditionally by the coastal populations had become a menace to diplomacy. In sum, Prétout would state that there had not been pirates in France in the Middle Ages, even though there had been violence at sea, as a matter of course, and even though there had been a discourse on piracy, construed by courtiers in order to subdue the maritime population. One could argue that this is a slightly romantic conception, shaping the gens de mer as mere victims of early modern state building or late medieval state building. But the overall argument is a welcome confirmation of what I and others have written during the past 10 years. Also, in terms of method, it is an approach very similar to what I am striving for. What in French is called lexicometrie and what we know as conceptual history or historical semantics, in German Begriffsgeschichte. But Prétout's thesis reveals a very French approach, since it focuses on the royal center of the state, the pirate being defined as the paradigmatic enemy of the king. Accordingly, in England, the rise of piracy as a legal concept has been associated with the Statute of Truces by Henry V from 1414, by which the use of force against other parties within a truce or peace was denounced as high treason. In detail, also this turns out to be a more complicated story, but the grand narrative is the same. At this point, it would have been worthwhile to look at the East, because other than Western Europe, the Holy Roman Empire simply did not have a monarch striving for a centralization of power. State building happened on the level of princely territories here and on the level of more or less autonomous towns, which always competed for hegemony in their environment. Not the monarchs installed admirals, public officers responsible for enforcing dominion over the seas, but for example, the Teutonic Order did so, or the harbor towns did so, as Hamburg and Lübeck in the 1470s. Within the Holy Roman Empire, competing and layered claims for power, jurisdiction, and legislation was simply normal. The king or emperor was a remote instance which merely randomly intervened in local politics. Indeed, he functioned as a reference for political claims. The Hanse, for example, traced back its status to being the community of all the emperor's merchants, pointing at more or less mythical privileges by Charlemagne for his traveling tradesmen. Accordingly, the emperor was said to be the special guardian of the major trading routes, and some of the Hanse towns, as again Lübeck and Hamburg, legitimized their claims for sovereignty on their streams, that is Trave and Elbe, by having gained respective privileges by the emperor. Alternatively, they also appealed to the Pope in order to get such privileges. This attempt seemed worthwhile because in 1229, Pope Gregory IX had decreed that seamen attacking ships en route for the Papal States were piratas and thus to be treated as infidels. Since during the 14th century, this decree was promulgated each year on Shaft Thursday in all churches, it came to be generally known that pirates were enemies of the church and of Christianity. In northern Germany, though, the pirate as a concept, when it emerged, was not framed as the enemy of either the Roman emperor or the Pope. Rather, authorities here remarkably early relied on the so-called Ciceronian paradigm of piracy, as introduced into Roman law by Bartolus de Sassoferrato in the middle of the 14th century. The pirate as the enemy of all, or of humankind, hostis omnium or hostis humani generis. This was a very abstract concept, though. In practice, the Hanse towns, which were governed by merchants, associated the public goods simply with the well-being of the mercantile class. Henceforth, in Hanse parlance, the pirate became the enemy of the common merchant. And this is the leading hypothesis which I would like to survey in my book. I would argue that the emergence of the piracy discourse is not to be understood as an outcome of state building, as long as this means a top-down process of disciplining and subjugating the people of the central power. For example, in earlier years, Pierre Prétout himself has participated in projects which focused on how the harbor towns from the Iberian Peninsula up to Flanders tried to restrict maritime violence by use of mutual diplomacy, by use of force, also by appealing to their kings. Other than described in his new book, the invention of piracy in France apparently also answered a growing need on the side of the local authorities. As some colleagues and I have argued in a collected volume 2 years ago, which David just mentioned, we have to model this process as one arbitrated between local actors, their authorities, and central institutions. And all these actors on different levels did not intend to build a state, but they strived for influence and for access to goods, to markets. The newly emerging concepts of illicit distribution, like smuggling and piracy, served as a means to exclude competitors from markets and to foster one's own connectivity. Hegemonic actors enforced their position by claiming regional monopoles and thus making their weaker neighbors infringe upon these so that they could be disqualified as pirates, as smugglers, or the like. Only retrospectively, we historians tend to conceive the actors which prevailed in this process as protagonists of state building. And by doing so, we reproduce their own legitimizing discourses. Last Tuesday, during a panel at the Deutscher Historikertag, the general meeting of the Association of German Historians, we discussed this with some colleagues specialized in economic history mainly. Interestingly enough, from the beginning, we all agreed upon the overall thesis. Nobody pleaded for a juxtaposition of state building and market formation. Apparently, these two must be understood as two sides of a coin: the commercial revolution of the later Middle Ages and the formation of early modern statehood being, say, interrelated processes. Primarily, what happened from the 14th century onwards in Northern Europe was a process which Stuart Jenks has called the distribution revolution. Until then, traveling merchants from very different regions and places had sustained trade by themselves calling distant destinations, thus altogether forming a sort of dense web of connections. Now, the stronger places developed into hubs which concentrated trade on their preferred routes, forcing the smaller actors to call them and to rely on intermediary trade more and more. The web changed into a network with fewer but stronger connections between fewer but stronger knots, every one of which building a centralized structure in its own environment. In practice, a harbor town had to secure its trading routes by forcing the adjacent powers not to interfere in them anymore. So it had to claim for a monopole by excluding competing neighbors from distribution. And often enough, it had to enforce all this by the use of force. To accuse competitors for being pirates or smugglers, or at least for having sheltered such malefactors, was one means to reach this goal. A concept obviously helpful to grasp this, we found in recent works on new institutional economics, especially by Douglas North, John Wallace, and Barry Weingast. For them, state building is always a competition between economic actors in the first place. The strongest faction of economic/political actors usually claims to be representing the state, or what North and others call the natural state or the elementary state. These are stages on a systematic scale, but I will not go into this now. The natural state strives for monopolizing the use of force, but has to enforce this claim against competing factions within the state. The idea of a state does thus precede its realization. The semantics are there yet before they come to be filled by institutions, one could say. While this is surely just an abstract model, the pragmatic idea of the state helps us to abandon the very emphatic perception of it, deeply rooted especially in German political thinking. In the end, this idea is not a very new one. In piracy studies we call it the Augustinian paradigm, because Augustine in his City of God contains a respective episode, which Sophia Mösch mentioned the other day. Alexander the Great once met a pirate called Diomed, and he asked him why he had become such a malefactor. The pirate answered, "What I do with a small vessel, you do with a large fleet. This is why I am called a pirate, while you are called a king." As is very often the case in medieval thinking, the counter-arguments against the leading worldview were well known yet, albeit being disqualified as utterances of socially illicit speakers, as in this case. A pirate is allowed to say something or to tell what's true. For us, it is important to keep in mind that state building is a violent process, that it is intertwined with the formation of markets, especially with processes of concentration and hierarchization of distribution, and that the emergence of a new regime of maritime violence could possibly be modeled as part of these processes. As handbooks tell us, the monarchs in Western Europe during the later Middle Ages more or less managed to gain a considerable degree of control over their realms. To do so, they had to overcome severe obstacles, especially the competing princes claiming for autonomous territorial rule within their own duchies and counties, respectively. And this the crowns did, thus successively enlarging the scope of their power from their own domain to the entire kingdom. The Holy Roman Empire, though, remained structured as a confederation of political entities of very different sort. The princely territories being themselves heterogeneous and shaped by layered claims for power and legislation. Autonomous towns, more or less autonomous towns, even imperial villages, petty nobles, barons, counts, dukes, they all claimed for authority in their area, or maybe for sovereignty, one could say. And they did so in an inherently competitive way. As we have learned from Sebastian Spitra's talk, even 19th century judges in the US had to come to terms with this. Very seemingly, the Holy Roman Empire is a prime example for legal pluralism. In legal history, the sea has often been understood as a space originally free of any law. According to this, only in modern times, the maritime powers agreed upon a code of universal sea laws. As for the Middle Ages, this might be the case for the open sea, but in fact, this is a truism since simply nobody went to the open sea then. As long as technical devices for astronomical navigation were lacking, mariners avoided to do anything else than cabotage. They sailed along the coasts, orientating themselves by looking at landmarks and signs, and by checking depth and ground using the perpendicular. At the most, they used the sun and the stars to cross smaller seas in some days' distance, as long as they knew at least approximately where they would reach land again. When we discuss the sea before the 15th century, we talk about an amphibian space, the area between land, coast, harbor, and water. And this amphibian space was by no means free of legal claims. As a matter of fact, adjacent authorities claimed for dominion over their shores, especially over the trade routes in their vicinity, which were often called their stream, Strom, even if straits were concerned. Stream was a legal term, not a geographical one, meaning an authority's sovereignty over a water route. There even were territorial concepts of legal spaces in front of the shore belonging to one authority. For example, if one town wrote to another that in the latter's area there were a gathering of robbers which the addressee was asked to expulse. As Emily Somatai has shown, the maritime sphere, as far as mariners traveled it, was conceptualized legally as the march, marca, as an analogy of the vast border zones between realms at land where competing claims for power had to be arbitrated and where no authority could enact its own legislation and jurisdiction without opposition. In these zones, special officials appointed by the hegemonic authorities tried to enforce their power. At land, we know them as Margraves, Markgrafen in German. At sea, from the High Middle Ages onwards, they were often called admirals, which is in fact an Arab term which was introduced into most European languages. That is to say that the maritime sphere of the later Middle Ages is also obviously a very intriguing example for a case study on what we call legal pluralism. In practice, the inhabitants of the marches had to come to terms with one another using an orally transmitted code of conduct And this is what mariners and merchants did in their everyday life at sea. The main task of this code of conduct was to ensure exchange and distribution, which means on the one hand to secure traveling the water routes, while on the other to give actors a means to force each other to stick to the rules. We tend to conceive violence as a threat to distribution, but again, according to Douglas North and others, we have to presuppose that in a natural or elementary statehood, the capability of all actors to use force if needed was the most important tool to reproduce social order. Pre-modern markets are ruled by mutual deterrence. Since actors on these markets are not equally strong, the markets are in fact informed by very variable power structures. And paradoxically, as this may sound, just because the actors are all able and willing to fight, their world is comparably peaceful, as long as none of the actors grows too strong to be enclosed by the others. On an abstract level, this is just the process described by Prétout and others, according to which from the 15th century onwards, hegemonic actors strived for the installation of a new legal regime in the maritime sphere. They claimed for substituting the old regime of mutual deterrence by a royal, princely, or at least proto-stately monopole of violence. The emerging discourse of piracy became the most eminent tool to enforce this new regime because it gave authorities the opportunity to disqualify any actor using force autonomously as a pirate. The authorities did not use this weapon every time someone did so, for in most cases the perpetrator might have been too strong to get him in terms of military capability, economic power, social or political background. But just because piracy as an abstract concept for absolute lawlessness was far from realistic, it served very well as a tool one could apply when needed and feasible. Unfortunately, as I said, the sea as a march was long time shaped by codes of conduct, which do not appear in written sources directly. In order to observe them, I would suggest trying historical semantics or conceptual history, an analysis of the terminology used in the sources, an approach very similar to the one of Prétout. Since the law of the seas does not know piracy as a delict until the 16th century, we have to scrutinize the practice of how actors arbitrated and how authorities treated cases of maritime violence. So how did people describe violent actions in particular situations, depending on the sort of record, on the intended goals, on the audience, the situation as such? Which terms did they use to denote the violent actors, depending on the legal and social status these actors had, or the speakers wanted to express by this denomination? Competing actors on all the different layers of the highly pluralist field use terminology in order to strengthen their position and weaken those of the others. Contested semantics thus correlate with and accordingly show the plurality of legal claims. From a say global historian's point of view, still in the 14th century, Northern Europe was a region half real, half mythical, merely a periphery of the Mediterranean. And this is what you see on this map. You see that the one who made it, well, he did not really know so much about the North. Trade volumes in the North Sea and Baltic reached no more than about 20% of those of the Mediterranean. If recent German historiography calls the Hanse a secret superpower, this is more about traditional desires for national greatness than about medieval history. However, the look at the North is worthwhile because as for the semantics of maritime violence, we can observe remarkable particularities here, especially if compared with the North Atlantic and with the Mediterranean. According to Pierre Prétout, in French parlance from the 12th century onwards, we can detect a search for a terminology proper to denote the imagined malefactors, which heroic Romans in antique tradition called piratas. from larron to larron de mer, from this to écumeurs, verbally skimmers, which is only very lately replaced by the loan word pirate in French. A similar time of semantic variability we see in the Low German case, emerging from the 13th century onwards. And it does so about 100 years earlier than in France and England, which is a remarkable fact, since in most fields of maritime history, the North lags behind Western and Southern Europe. People in the North did not adopt the legal regime of the West unhesitatingly, but as it seems, they already discussed the concepts behind it. The Latin term pirata is used in chronicles as early as in the first half of the 13th century. But it is not a legal concept yet, but a literate allusion to classical readings. With a strong religious connotation, it's always about crusaders and pagans, the pagans being pirates. Around 1249, pirates and robbers, a twin category, appear in treaties between the emerging harbor towns on the southern shores of the Baltic, the later Hanse towns. Obviously, Lübeck and its allies had adopted the term in order to legitimize their claims for controlling the traffic routes as early as this. But again, this was about the Latin writing of urban chancelleries. When they changed to the vernacular, they did not adopt pirata into Low German until as late as the 1470s. Instead, they usually denoted maritime violent actors as Seerovere, sea robbers, just as their French colleagues used larron de mer. So to take up the question posed in the title of my paper, were there pirates in the North and the later Middle Ages? At first look, an answer would be yes, if this means that there were actors who were called so by others. But we always have to keep in mind that this is due to the tactical use of terminology in political parlance. The writers who used this term were sitting in their scriptorium and presumably keen on showing their erudition in the first place. Secondly, they and their patrons had a political agenda, and their terminology tells us more about this agenda than about what had happened at sea. So if we understand pirates as outlaws striving for booty for mere egoistic reasons, the answer very presumably must be no, we do not find such people in the sources. We only find words and their usage. From around 1370 onwards, terminology grows more and more variable, with several phrases forming a sort of continuum of categories from completely illicit, pirata and loose party, via ambivalent, like Seerovere, or well, say neutral, like Utliger, up to rather licit terms like Hulpere, Funde, helpers, friends, servants. A very special case is the one term which interests me the most in my project, Vitalian brodere. Or rather the two terms, since the second one, Likkedeler, seems to be primarily a Flemish and Dutch synonym of the Low German Vitalian brodere. On the one hand, these could be used very neutrally to denote fighters, which in English would have been called privateers, or in French, corsaires, at least later on. That is, combatants legitimized by appointment of an authority. On the other, we quite early find Vitalian brothers associated with the Ciceronian idea of hostis omnium, enemy of all. Bartolus de Sassoferrato had used this in his Tractatus de Repressaliis in about 1354. And even though we do not know whether this treatise was used by anyone in Northern Europe at that time, it is quite likely, not by chance, that this phrase does appear in debates on the status of warrior businessmen on land as well as at sea soon afterwards. In 1398, a group of Italian brothers hired by the Frisian chieftain Keno Tombroke claimed that they were God's friend or the world's foe. This resembles the battle cries of coeval mercenary captains, which I have listed on the slide, primarily indicating sort of the escalation logic of typical for the propaganda of warrior businessmen. They call themselves the enemy of God, right? But the Vitalian brothers, the message of the Vitalian brothers continued: all the world's foe, except for Hamburg and Bremen, since there we can go to and from as we like. Both towns from time to time had collaborated with the Tombrokes, hence it was by no means illusionary that the Vitalian brothers, hosted by them, now suggested an agreement of, say, mutual non-aggression to those towns and to the entire Hanse. Keno Tombrok's men referred to the motive of the enemy of all, just to clarify that they claimed not to be such enemies of all, but combatants with a political intention and combatants with patrons helping them. Obviously, as early as during the 1390s, the status of people called Vitalian brothers was debated following the patterns of the emerging Ciceronian paradigm. Accordingly, some years later in 1400, a flotilla from Hamburg and Lübeck was able to execute whole crews of fighters in East Friesland summarily, just because they were Vitalian brothers. While in the same year, the Count of Holland appointed 114 men for his feuds who were explicitly called Vitalian brothers in their treaty. Obviously, this phrase's meaning could range from completely illicit, just like a synonym of piracy, to completely licit, meaning something like combatant, or what later times would call privateer. Interestingly enough, also Pierre Prétout mentions the Vitalian brothers in his new book. But the way he describes them accords to the outdated state of research usually reproduced in popular handbooks on maritime history. Allegedly, from around 1391 onwards, the Vitalian brothers had gathered as fighters hired by the Dukes of Mecklenburg in order to help their relative, King Albert of Sweden, in his war against Queen Margaret of Denmark. When this war came to a halt in 1395, the said warriors lost their appointment, but since they carried on raiding the seas and attacking friends and foe, they became pirates. In 1398, they were driven out of their nest on the island of Gotland by the Teutonic Order, so that they had to go to East Friesland, where they found new patrons in the feuds of the local chiefs. In 1400, the mighty Hanse towns, Hamburg, Lübeck, and Bremen, invaded East Friesland, defeated the chiefs, and managed to expel the Vitalian brothers. So it goes. Finally, in a fierce battle close to the island of Heligoland, Hamburg defeated the last Vitalians, which were beheaded on the shores of the Elbe. As I already mentioned in my introductory paper, virtually nothing about this narrative is correct. The term Vitalian brothers does occur earlier than 1391. It does occur in quite different contexts, and it does occur long after 1400, until at least 1466. It is used quite often between around 1390 and about 1436. And it does not denote a pirate company which had fought against the merchants of the Hanse or anything like that. But what does it mean then? Admittedly, when I started to investigate this, I was strongly tempted to produce a kind of tabula rasa by simply completely denying the existence of the Vitalian brothers as a social group within historical reality. Why not deconstrue this group as a fiction grounded in the narratives of the Hanse elites, an imagination invented to legitimize the merchants' claims for power? The answer is quite easy, and I already mentioned this in my reading session. There are few but undebatable instances within which people call themselves Vitalian brothers, or at least obviously do not refuse to be called so by others. This led me to the conclusion that there must have been some small groups in the 1390s who indeed called themselves Vitalian brothers, but these small groups with something like a common identity or something seem to have vanished by short notice, because after 1403 we do not hear of them anymore. As far as we can tell, this group had no institutional structure. It seems to have been more a subculture than an organization. This may sound odd to modern ears, but as I mentioned in my reading session, it is in fact typical for medieval institutions. Very often we find those institutions mentioned in the evidence long before we learn anything about their inner structure. Even the Hanse itself developed proper institutional regulations only in the 16th century when its real powers were soon waning. But what about all the other instances where Vitalian brothers were mentioned in quite different contexts and with quite different connotations? For example, after the truce of 1395 on the island of Gotland, both sides, the Danish and the Mecklenburg, kept on relying on the help of people called Vitalian brothers, and both sides simultaneously accused each other of doing so. Besides these apparently existing groups, the name had soon become say, generic term, a general classification, apt to denote professional fighters appointed by the feuding parties in the several wars that shook Northern Europe. This generic term had the broad variety of meanings just sketched, which made it a perfect stand-in for the piracy discourse, which was going to emerge a little later. That is to say that the Vitalian brothers were fact and fiction, or rather fact and imagination, historical reality, but slightly different from what handbooks tell us, and general classification used within the parlance of political elites to give a name to the otherwise anonymous menace to mercantile practice, which had arisen from the escalating conflicts in the maritime sphere. But how was this enigmatic phenomenon treated by contemporaries then? Hanse elites more and more perceived the growing milieu of professionals on the violence market as a menace to trade and political hegemony. However, merchants and their authorities themselves simply needed those warriors for the settlement of their conflicts. Therefore, towns like Lübeck discriminated these service providers collectively as Seerovere or Vitalian Brodere, de facto as pirates, while simultaneously employing them as individual actors for their own wars. For example, as one of the most notorious masters of the Vitalian brothers in early times in the 1390s, we know the Mecklenburg nobleman Otto Pekkatel or Otto von Pekkatel. Like his brother Albrecht, bailiff of Stockholm until 1395, he participated in several operations of his dukes against Denmark in the fights for Gotland before and after 1395, and in the failed conquest of Stockholm in 1397. But when Lübeck and Hamburg waged war against the Dukes of Braunschweig-Lüneburg in 1396, they engaged just him, this prominent Vitalian brother, while his comrade Sven Sture and some other Vitalian brothers are known to have sided the Guelphs, the Dukes of Braunschweig-Lüneburg. Soon after this, they together again sided the Swedish nobleman Knut Boson, leader of the Mecklenburg faction in Scandinavia, in his feud against Queen Margaret of Denmark. When Margaret prevailed, Otto Pekkatel and his comrades changed sides. Otto ended as the Queen's bailiff of Korsholm Castle in Ostrobothnia, which is today in Finland, which he had conquered in Knut Boson's service 2 years ago. In practice, obviously, allegiance was a quite ambiguous and variable thing, while on the level of discourse, one could act as if things were clear-cut. And one can detect the descendants of those Germans or Vitalian brothers in Finland until today. This is what the people from the museum in Korsholm Castle told me. In general, the term Vitalian Brodere seems to have undergone a successive shift in meaning during the first decades of the 15th century, inconsistently and depending on political evaluation though, but tending to eliminate the legal aspects of a combatant status more and more in favor of a criminalization, changing a category of maritime warfare into an umbrella term for a general menace to seafaring and trade. This semantic shift happened primarily within the communication between three instances: the see of the master of the Teutonic Order at the Marienburg, Malborg today, the Lübeck Council, and the court of the Roman king Sigismund. This is the only time that the king got involved in the German debate on maritime violence, as far as I know. He did so not because of his own concerns about piracy, but because his cousin and ally, King Eric of Denmark, pushed him to do so. When the Count of Holstein had waged war against King Eric of Denmark in 1410, Hamburg had begun to support him in his war, while Lübeck had tried to remain a neutral arbiter. In 1426, struggles concerning the Öresund toll led Lübeck, Rostock, and Wismar to enter the war against Eric. Just as the Mecklenburg towns had done in 1391, in 1427, Lübeck and its allies offered free conduct to all troops keen on fighting the Danes upon their own risk, with exactly the same wording, except for one restriction. Assassins and outlawed people should not be allowed to enter the town's bands. This is apparently a reaction to political debates concerning the procedure chosen, looking at the procedure in 1391 chosen by the Mecklenburg towns. When rumor had it that Eric made efforts to hire the eminent consortium of warriors led by one Bartholomeus Vogt, who had been successfully active in England for long years, the towns hurried to forestall the king and appoint Vogt themselves. With his company of more than 1,000 men, he would soon become the most important organizer of their maritime warfare, notwithstanding the fact that even the allied Count of Holstein called him a Vitalian brother. On a large scale, Vogt's ships now attacked trade in the Baltic, especially that of the Prussian and Livonian towns, which in vain claimed for neutrality when he installed a blockade of their harbors. Nota bene, ships hired by Lübeck and Hamburg beleaguered Hanseports like Dansk, Riga, and Reval. And Vogt wrote a letter to the councils of these towns claiming that he was only there to protect them, right? The Teutonic Order appealed to the Roman king Sigismund, who had supported the Danish claims against Holstein for years. Thus, he requested his imperial town Lübeck to refrain from all enmities against his ally, to no avail. On a sort of shuttle diplomacy journey, his envoy Nikolaus Stock visited the master of the order, Lübeck, and the Danish court in Copenhagen. In front of the Hanse Diet, Stock delivered an expressive speech blaming Lübeck for, out of sheer selfishness, having engaged with the evil Vitalian brothers, which he copiously compared to all sort of foes of Christianity, Turks, heretics, Hussites, and other apocalyptic threats. If the towns refused to agree upon a peace with King Eric, they would be banned and excommunicated as consolers and supporters of heretics, he said. Before going to Lübeck, Nikolaus Stock had visited Marienburg Castle, the see of the master of the Teutonic Order. Very presumably, he had learned about the notorious Vitalian brothers and the imaginations associated with them there, because, as I mentioned, within the order's propaganda, the equation of the Vitalian brothers with pirates, and thus with heretics, according to the papal decree of 1229, was usual since the early 1390s, notwithstanding the fact that the order himself had been remarkably tolerant facing Mecklenburg's practice of maritime violence, and that the order himself used to hire mercenaries too. As a matter of fact, Lübeck and the Wendish towns explicitly accepted all the king's requests. But when Nikolaus Stock had just reached Copenhagen some days later, he had to observe Lübeck ships attacking the castle. Finally, Stock's own entourage fell prey to Rostock Utligas, privateers, which apparently killed some of his servants. Some month before, the king's chamberlain, Michael Honingen, had been captured by Wismar ships as well. For years, Stock and Honingen would have to litigate against the said towns to at least get compensation for these brutal fouls. As I mentioned, Hamburg and Lübeck legitimated their fight against piracy, referring to privileges by Sigismund's father, Charles IV. But now, when their monarch asked them for peace, they treated him like a cumbersome minor applicant. Stock's report to his king thus ends wearily. On such a, I quote, "On such a peace message, I did not receive a consistent answer by the said towns for a long time." Here we come to detect political debates between the Hanse members, including the master of the order, and also presumably within Lübeck society. How could the city and its allies confederate with just those people it had vituperated as de facto pirates for about 25 years before? Of course, as always, the council claimed for striving for the common good of the entire Hanse when doing so, but at least the Prussian towns had very explicitly stated that this war was just about Lübeck's market shares in the Baltic, and accordingly they had refused to join the anti-Danish alliance. On the contrary, the perception of the Vitalian brothers as a general menace to political order as it had been developed around 1400 was now exaggerated by the Teutonic order and by royal diplomacy using connotations of heresy and infidelity, and employed against Lübeck's policy itself. Other than his French neighbors, King Sigismund did not refer to piracy as a menace to his own majesty and sovereignty, but he relied on the papal conception of pirates as enemies of Christianity, which the Teutonic order had transmitted to the north. Just in this time, in the late 1420s and 1430s in Lübeck, the legend of Klaus Störtebeker and the Vitalian brothers does emerge. That is to say that Lübeck chroniclers, especially one Franciscan Dominican called Hermann Korner, they sort of invent the Klaus Störtebeker legend in order to give the council and the town's elites the option to project the piracy discourse onto history and to camouflage the own, relations to these persons. Klaus Störtebeker and Bartholomäus Voth were both called Vitalian brothers. None of them was a pirate in real life, I would suppose, but they both had to, or their patrons had to cope with the emerging piracy discourse. To sum up, in Northern Europe, and especially in the Holy Roman Empire, the emergence of the early modern pirate discourse was shaped by slightly different patterns than in France. Due to a higher degree of legal pluralism, the search for a proper new terminology led to an increased semantic variety, including the enigmatic denomination Vitalian brothers. It is not easy to grasp what was behind this phrase historically. Easier it seems to describe how it functioned semantically. In the beginnings, it was at least also used by a subculture of violent actors as a self-description. But soon it became a generic term, a classificatory category for autonomous warriors at sea. Depending on the situation, these could be perceived as licit combatants and helpers in feud, or as absolutely illicit outlaws, as a stand-in for the emerging concept of the pirate as the enemy of all. In Hanse parlance, this was especially the case if the well-being of the merchant was at stake, not that of the king or the common good. The enemy of the merchant became the apex of evil. In this sense, the phrase Vitalian brothers, in all its ambiguity, marks an important step in the development of the early modern concept of piracy. As an historical phenomenon, they very presumably were rather a short episode in the history of maritime war in the north. But as a fiction, as an imagination, they are virulent as the mythic antagonists of the Hanse until today. To criticize this myth is thus an important step to a more precise understanding of the legal regime in the maritime north of the 14th to the 16th centuries. Thank you for your patience and for your attention.